Greetings and welcome to the Talkback. My name's Joseph Newland. I'm Director of Publishing at the Menil. And I'd like to just say a few words before we get going after that fabulous performance by Sarah. We are going to answer questions. So if you'd like to open the chat, you're free to put questions in there and they'll be monitored. And we will watch that, and we'll also have some help. Yes. Welcome to Hearing Color and Seeing Sound, a program of The Departing Landscape, Morton Feldman's Palais de Marie, played by Sarah Rothenberg, the artistic director of DACAMERA. She's joined tonight by Paul R. Davis, the Curator of Collections at the Menil. Let me just say a couple of words about something else beforehand. We're lucky that the Ancient World Gallery was featured, and we have just finished printing a book on the Ancient World Gallery that will be coming soon. That is Paul's project. It's called Object Biographies, Collaborative Approaches to Ancient Mediterranean Art. And it is a compilation of essays edited by John North Hopkins, Sarah Costello, and Paul R. Davis, all people working here out of Houston when the project started. And they joined with 13 other scholars looking at the Ancient World collection here at the Menil for the first time since the museum has opened. You'll see the book will become available in February, and it will have pieces unknown, many things that the scholars found particularly interesting to write an object biography about, but it will also feature in its very first essay, the votive figure that you saw figure prominently in tonight's presentation. So, and without further ado, I would turn it over to Paul to place us in the ancient world.
Well, thank you for that nice introduction, Joseph. It's really wonderful to be part of this panel, and I think like with the wonderful piece that Sarah played in the gallery, it automatically puts us there. The gallery was recently reinstalled in 2018, and so fortunately it was enough space to fit a baby grand piano for Sarah to play her wonderful piece. The collection really features the core of the Menil's ancient art collection. A lot of the pieces that we saw in the video are from the ancient Mediterranean, particularly from the Eastern Mediterranean, Anatolia, the Cyclades Islands. And so I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about that once we get into it.
Did you have anything in particular you wanted to observe about why you chose the galleries? It says a little bit in the beginning of the film, but how did you feel from being in the galleries playing with the art?
Well, you know, Morton Feldman has such a long relationship to these kinds of ancient objects. There are stories about he and Mark Rothko used to go and visit the ancient galleries of the Metropolitan Museum in New York. So that's true with all of Morton Feldman's music in a sense. It's something that goes through his music, but it's particularly true of this piece because of the connection of the inspiration of seeing an image of the Palais de Marie and then naming his very last piano piece after that. So those objects have such a sense of magic about them. You know, they have so much time in them, and yet they're also so filled with this human impulse to create useless objects that are art. You know, it's one thing to create a pot, but to create a statue is so at the essence of what it means to be human that there's something incredibly powerful about seeing those objects and incredibly moving, and they have time captured in them. So it seemed to me a very visual and powerful correspondence to what Feldman does in his music, separate from the actual anecdotal reasons to do something like this.
Well, I think that idea of time is a real important one, because the time in the ancient world gallery is sort of disjunctive and fragmented, like, and we have this presentation of these ancient objects that were used for funerary rites, for worshiping deities, and they're presented today in the 21st century as sort of these objects that are disassociated from their original cultural context. And so there's this tremendous fragmentation of time. And I think that the piece that you played by Morton Feldman is indicative of that as well. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, sort of this idea of time and space and in the position in the gallery.
Yeah, and just you talking about those objects, of course, the other connection that's so strong is between the modern and the ancient. And in the objects themselves, I mean, there's that one very small nude that we go back to a few times, and I call it the Matisse nude, you know, and then of course, you know, the very abstract, almost facial, those statues that we see up and down, you know, are so powerful and so influential on what we think of the modern. So I think that connection between the modern and the ancient already has so much time in it. And then there's the whole, you know, the whole idea, I call the film The Departing Landscape, because of what Feldman said about music and about sound. And I quote that in the opening of the film, about that the music is not the attack of the note. You know, it's not when the key of the piano goes down and you get that initial sound, but it's what happens after. And what happens after is the sound leaving us rather than coming towards us. And so that's an oral image, but it's also an image about time, right? And memory is the departing landscape. And I first started playing this piece, you know, as I say in the beginning, in a very, very sad moment. First, I had the piece on my piano, as sometimes pieces do, I mean, the music, hoping to find a time to learn it at some point. And then I first played just 2 minutes of it for once we all went into lockdown and the whole world was in lockdown, and Radio France in Paris actually asked me for a 2-minute segment of something. They were doing, as a lot of people were doing, these kinds of studies of musicians at home during COVID. And I played just the first very opening of the piece. And then it was soon after that that this very dear friend of mine died very suddenly, Maurice Berger, in the very beginning of the COVID epidemic. And so this piece now is bound up with those memories. The power in the music, I think, is hard to isolate, because there's a kind of cumulative power to this piece. It's very moving, and it occupies a kind of liminal space. It's kind of like the piece is in between. I mean, it's in between life and maybe afterlife, but it holds us in a suspended emotional state that I think is very questioning, but also goes from the individual to something larger. And that's what we were really trying to do visually as well. And that's what these objects open up the possibility of doing.
Well, that whole notion of memory is something that really strikes me in Feldman's music and in this piece, because you keep hearing a figure and it's almost like, did I hear that before, or was it slightly different? Is that it again? And I feel like there's sort of this suspension in there. And it was very interesting to see what you and John Carrithers, the filmmaker, did, sort of juxtaposing that with, like, say, a vase, or just showing one object that was like a very static object, and it almost felt like the two kinds of stasis came together, and then it would be memory. It's like, oh, there's another figure that's sort of a violin shape, that's a human figure, but a slight variation on it. And it really did have this beautiful juxtaposition of sort of formal similarities, and echoing things. And I really like what you said about memory, because so often you have to sort of recall things, but it's very intuitive. It's not quite so much an analytical, was that exactly the piece before, but that I've heard that sequence or nearly that sequence.
Well, and so much music moves in more like a narrative, right?
Mhm.
It moves forward. It's a linear sense of time. And Feldman's is not. And he was very, very influenced by painting. He was so close to the abstract expressionists in the 1960s and the 70s. And he talks about how he was striving for stasis. I don't think that the music ultimately is static, but rather than a painting, for me, it's very much like a mobile. Which is the solar system is kind of the ultimate mobile, I guess. But it's the idea of things suspended and rotating at different rhythms, really, and reappearing at irregular times. And as you say, Joseph, you don't know when to expect them, and they reconfigure each time that they come back. And it was interesting because as soon as I started, working with John Carrithers, I had this early film that I had done in my house that I did back in March. So he had a visual of me playing the piece, and it actually wasn't until I saw even the one that I made on my iPhone how I moved so slowly. And in the process of editing, there were times when I thought I was looking at the film in slow motion, and I realized that no, that was actually how I was moving through these long silences of the piece. And so this idea of departing landscape and the resonance of sound was something that John immediately understood in terms of the resonance of visuals as well. And I had talked from the start that I didn't want to do a literal performance in the space, that I wanted you to see the objects unrealistically. The size of the objects, when you're seeing my hands through that pot, the pot is about, this big, so the idea is when you're going to do something like this, to make things possible that are not possible in a real life situation. I mean, that's what makes it filmic to me, that you do things that can only be done in film. So working with John on what we could do visually, and rather than absolutely mimic what goes on in the musical structure, although once we had the initial film, I went through with very specific timings of when these events recur, and I kind of labeled things, A, B, C, D, and where they come, and so that we could make a kind of parallel but different visual language. But the idea of objects recurring, and then working very closely on how they recur, and what Joseph used the word variation, what variation is there visually in the way they come back and when they come back, and at what point, when do we go back to the hands? So that was all very thought through in the way the music is constructed, but not as a kind of literal parallel, but hopefully to capture the same thing visually as an experience.
I think that that parallels nicely with what the book tries to do too, in a way, in that it talks about these different moments that are in the lives of the objects, and how they go from these ancient contexts to the moments where they're collected and rediscovered, to the moments where they are put in a museum for display at some point, and for future interpretations for future generations and future scholars. And so like the notations of the music, they have continual resonance as they live their lives in the future. So it's a wonderful sort of, it's wonderful that you were able to play this piece inside the gallery with reference to those objects.
Well, and the objects have so much mystery, right? It's almost what we don't know that's more powerful than what we know about those objects.
That's definitely true. I think we can say that's definitely true about the book too. I know that's one of the things that my co-editors, John Hopkins and Sarah Costello, we both sort of merged around, was what we didn't know and what we might be able to find out.
Well, for me, the image is behind me, which is literally a pin board for use. It's almost like it's fragments being refragmented. You've put them into narratives and the essays, but I think about how they're discovered. And so often, sure, there are archaeological sites where you're taking things in layers and you know it's an altar piece or something. But a lot of times it's just found things here and there. Or I think about collectors finding them sort of just juxtaposed hither and yon, and then they have to emerge into this other story. But in the meantime, they're sort of in suspended time. And that's where I find the Feldman feels like the suspended time of, I almost had that image of being in the desert, because I have seen a couple pictures of the site of the Mari Palace, and it's just brown. And I think about in the original archaeological reports, they worked out the rooms of the palace, and they almost look like the patterns of the rugs that Morton Feldman was also extremely interested in. They're not regular, they're irregular, but they're related. And again, it sort of looks like the music feels. And I'm sure that you can analyze those patterns. But for me, it's really based on more that semblance of memory. As I look at the objects, they sort of also are in stasis in the case, and they can only be repopulated by understanding them. And so I'm really grateful for Paul and his colleagues for helping put them into some kind of structure that we can understand.
Sarah, I wanted this last time of watching the video live, I just want to ask, it seems that there's almost a ritualistic process of playing this piece. I know this is not the first time you've played it, and it just seems to me that there's a sort of embodied way of performing this piece, and just the gestures of your hands, the way they pace to the piano to hit the keys. It just makes me sort of reflect on the original purpose of those objects in ancient history, and also sort of the ways in which you're performing on the piano and creating the sound that then emanates.
Well, I think it gets us into a spiritual space. And I think for especially those of us who are not religious people, that is like the spiritual essence of all those questions of life and what comes after life, and these objects that represent survival, but they also represent the passage of time. And of course, if the departing landscape is how we experience time, right? The landscape is what is behind us in a sense. And this is, to me, the essence of why music is so powerful to me, because music is such a metaphor for life itself. It exists in time. There is no life without time. And the departing landscape has to do with, I think, also how we make meaning out of time. And the departing landscape also has a kind of sense of mourning about it too, which for me has become associated with this piece because of the time when I first learned it, and because of this mystery of COVID that surrounds us. I mean, mortality always surrounds us, but in this time of COVID, it has become a danger as soon as you step out the door. It's a very different way of experiencing things. And so when a life does pass, you have that moment after where I feel you remember things incredibly intensely. I mean, if you lose a friend, you remember, and you realize from now on, this is what you will have. This is the landscape that you have. And there's a sense of departure because you're moving in time further and further from those memories. But we don't experience time in as linear a fashion as one might think. I think we experience time much more as it comes out in Morton Feldman's music. And we experience things internally that have nothing to do with time. We may feel very, very close to people, especially now, people who we have not actually sat with for a very long time. And I think that's another reason that this music may be more accessible to people right now and speak to people more directly, because we've all been in this very strange suspended moment.
Suspension.
And yet at the same time, we're all in it together. So, you know, you have a friend in Europe and you know they're at home also. So even though we're more isolated than ever, we're experiencing something together, but we're experiencing it alone. And that is a very unusual moment, I think.
Yeah.
And Feldman's sense of suspended time is really there, because I have found during the COVID thing that sometimes time goes a lot slower. A lot of time, lived time goes fast, and you wonder, where did the day go? But not so much now. I think part of it is lack of stimulation and spontaneity. But I do feel like that sort of slow repetitiveness and wondering what's going to happen really is evoked by this.
Yeah, I think there's a tremendous sense, I'm glad you put it that way, of questioning in Feldman's music. You feel like these questions are being asked and they're just left.
They're just
there.
left hanging. Yes.
Yeah.
They're definitely hanging the whole space.
It's almost space punctuated by more space in a way. And I think like that's, I really think that's what's really powerful, is that the moments between the notations, it's almost Cajun in a way, like the way that notation allows you to think and contemplate between the next burst or sound.
So
yeah, well, so I think the like having it as part of this series that's been happening at the Menil Collection is really wonderful, in that it's allowed us to expand upon the presence of the artworks in the galleries, and in regards to like the ways in which the ancient world has been interpreted. You know, we could talk about the Cycladic works and the way that those have been interpreted through modernism, as well as the geometric Greek figure that's in the book, the warrior that was used by Picabia in terms of mythology. So there are these wonderful sort of connections that are generated through that narrative as well. And I think Morton Feldman is part of that important lineage.
Well, and I think it's so Menil Collection, because the Menil Collection, you know, we think of it 20th century, 21st century, but we think 20th century collection primarily, right? And then these other things that were specific interests of the de Menils, but then the Cycladic and the ancient art, and her belief in the spirituality of art and the spiritual power of art. So in a way, I feel like that ancient gallery has so much that is the core of the Menil Collection, even though it is, you know, it is not 20th century, but there's something about the spiritual power of those objects and how carefully chosen each one seems to be, and then how they radiate into all of the 20th century art that you see in the surrounding galleries.
You know, Siegfried Giedion talked about the spatial conception of ancient Egypt being space radiating volumes. And it's almost as if the ancient core is radiating out into the other galleries, into the direction of Americas and Africa, and then of course into Europe. So I think that's another powerful thing. We do have one sort of technical question in the chat, which is about the timing in the piece and sort of the floating sense of time, but the notation has got a lot of changes in it, and how you keep the pulse, Sarah, while playing it with the different changes of meter.
It is a pretty constant pulse. And, you know, as I've gotten more and more involved playing Morton Feldman's work, I'm amazed how precise the notation is, at least of the pieces that I've played. I mean, there are pieces that are freer, but I've also played several times his 4.5 hour long 4 Philip Guston, which is for flute, percussion, and piano and celeste. And I played it, we did it at Rothko Chapel with Steve Schick and Claire Chase, and then we did it out in Ojai. I think it's supposed to be 4 hours. It takes us about 4.5 hours, but you do not stop counting in those 4.5 hours, really. So it's extremely precise. And that's one of the reasons it takes so much concentration, because it's very hard to be precise in silence. It's easier to be precise when you're moving. So I guess it's a little like, I don't do Tai Chi. I imagine it's a little like Tai Chi, but it's a little like sustaining like maybe a yoga position. I don't know. In working on it, it's very different from working on any other music where you have technical challenges, you practice spots over and over. It's something very different. With Feldman, it's more about building to sustaining your focus and noticing things. You notice things, but as you were saying before, Joseph, a lot of the noticing is subliminal, and you don't want it to get too literal. But every time you play that piece, even if I play it alone in my house, it's a performance. It takes a performance energy to simply play through the entire piece.
So speaking of noticing things, do you notice your breathing? I mean, we've talked a little bit about breathing during COVID, and I wonder
if how hard it is everyone is having, and it may not just be COVID. I think it's just the world, the anxiety in the world in general.
Well, I mean, pacing of breathing, it's like counting breaths even.
No, but it's true. You've never seen so many articles about, people doing the 4, 7, 8 breathing or the square. I mean, people are having trouble breathing. You have to remember to breathe, or they're having trouble sleeping, or we're losing our inner rhythms. I think about breathing in this piece, but I think about breathing in any musical piece, but it's definitely your pulse and the focus, and it's physically extremely tiring to play this piece. And I didn't understand why until I saw a film of myself playing it and realized that there is a kind of constant motion, again, because if you stop moving, then the whole thing stops. And so how you sustain through it all has to do with a movement that's rather intuitive, especially on the piano. But I think it has to do with sound also. What kind of sound you get has to do with how you approach it. But it's more physically tiring than you would think.
I mean, that's sort of what I was trying to hint at earlier with this idea of this ritual of performance, or this embodied aspect of ritual, where your body becomes practice in ways of movement and ways of being that allows you to do things otherwise would be more difficult. And I think, just watching the video this time, the way you raise your hands and the way you engage with the piano as an almost animate thing is tanimate, reflects that. I think it's really powerful.
Well, I like it's bringing up ritual is very important, because I think we see ritual behind a lot of those objects, even if we don't know what the ritual was, and we get that aura of sacredness and magic and all of those things that put meaning in life that I think in modern life, you know, the Walmart doesn't replace that. I mean, we
So,
don't have, we look for that, but it's, and you get the feeling when you look at those objects that it was more part of life, or the belief system and the mystery and all of that. And I think Feldman does bring that into his music. You know, he is the least kind of, when you see pictures of Morton Feldman, and he was this kind of, you know, almost Rabelaisian character, you know, so down to earth. But the music does bring that sense of ritual that I think gets lost in the concert world as well. I mean, I think it's something we all need to be reminded of, and it makes it new. And I agree with you, Paul. I think it's very much part of playing the music, and maybe that's why even when I play it alone in my room, it feels like a performance in a way.
but speaking of ritual, Paul,
Hmm.
this particular figure is a votive figure that you might want to expand on a little bit.
Well, so as Sarah writes in her really wonderful chapter discussing these were used in temples in the different uh, archaeological sites today in Syria and modern day Iraq. That these were devotees that were put in place for people, particularly for, in most cases, people who could afford the commissioning or could afford the sculpture, the making of the sculpture. But they were deposited in these shrines as stand-ins, acting as a devotee for the person. So in permanent prayer or in permanent act of devotion for the deities, so that you know, good things would happen, bad things would be avoided. And in this particular case, you know, these type of figures, of which there are about, as Sarah writes, there are about 600 of them in the known lexicon of these statues. These are, most of them are fragmentary or in different states of condition, and you know, they're just incredibly powerful. The reason why this, I think probably one of the reasons why this is in the permanent collection is because the emphasis of the eyes and the ways in which the eyes are really evocative, and the position of the hands in a form of supplication. These are things that would have attracted, I'm sure, Dominique de Menil, if I can speak for her. But it raises those kinds of questions about the object and its history, and the importance of it, both in its historical ancient context, but also as we interact with it today. And those are all things that Sarah gets into.
And isn't that object, we don't know that it came from the Palais de Marie, but there were objects like that there. There's another one at the Louvre that, what do we know about the actual Palais de Marie? And
Well, we know it was the major center for a city-state in what is now commonly referred to as the Fertile Crescent. It was a Bronze Age, 3rd millennium BC city-state that was in competition with other ruling municipalities or kingdoms, and a real placeholder in sort of the trade network connecting Anatolia with the south, so the Arabian Peninsula, and also with Egypt. And so it's a really important place historically. It's where agricultural development happened, and so today it is a really important archaeological site. It was discovered in the 1930s, and it has been sort of excavated, but it's also been seriously damaged by you know, routine attacks from ISIS, and also historically looted as well.
yeah, I think I'd read that when it was discovered, it was for a while the oldest palace ruins that we knew of?
Yeah, I mean, it's third millennium BC, so that goes back, I mean, that's 2,000 years before you know, the modern era. So, or so I mean, it's quite old. I don't know if I couldn't speak to if it's the oldest ruins that were discovered, but it is definitely an important ancient site that is the history of the dynastic series in Mesopotamia. So that's particularly the Palais de Marie, or the Maori Palace, and that archaeological site is incredibly significant historically.
Yeah, and it's sad that, you know, when Feldman wrote this piece, when he saw this image at the Louvre, and I found an image that we use in the beginning of the film that just gives some sense of what Feldman might have seen, because I can't find research-wise exactly what it was that he saw, but yeah, you get a sense of that, but it's so sad that when he saw that, it was an active site, and since then it's actually become much more destroyed, and I understand, you know, much of it is in rubble, whereas it
Hmm.
was in a very different state. And so that those, you know, in the 40 years between 1980 and 2020 versus the thousands of years that came before, it's not a
I
very
mean,
great commentary on, you know, the times we're living in.
even in the last 10 years, I mean, you
Yeah,
could you could
right,
shrink that
right.
time
We can
down to
shrink
the
it
last 10.
to,
And it's the same situation with Palmyra and other important archaeological sites in that region that have just suffered tremendously. And I should say that the Mari is one archaeological site of many that are of incredible historical importance, and you can see um, archaeological artifacts from these sites throughout the U.S. and also in Europe, and in some cases, universities shared in the sort of the excavation of that and of these sites, and they have these wonderful objects in their permanent collection as well.
So there's a question, Sarah, was there any particular object in the ancient galleries that inspired you in this piece, or was it more the overall suspended time in that space?
well, there's no doubt that, I mean, the guy with the lapis eyes, you know, besides his eyes, his smile has a playfulness and a presence that is just astounding. I mean, I don't think anyone doesn't see that and smile when they see that object. There's something so incredibly spontaneous about it. So that was definitely, and that was the one object that we asked permission, you know, if we could get the glass case taken out of it so that John would be able to film around it a bit. But that whole first case that you come into, which is where you see, I mean, it's almost like Brancusi, like the long face that you see. And then that little nude figure, which to me is very unusual, the female nude that I call the Matisse. So those were I guess those figures spoke to me more immediately than the pots and the more useful objects, but I love the way John filmed those so that we got closer to them. And we decided to really, you know, focus on those objects which were closer in time probably to the palace that the piece is named for.
Yeah. So it's interesting because we were talking earlier about fragmentation, and you could apply that to the objects, and so in actuality, some of those things are probably more recent additions to the figure than. So these figures were used as votive figures, and then as Sarah writes, they were probably recarved or repurposed in ancient times. And then in addition, this one probably has some modern interventions into it as well. Um, and the lapis eyes are probably one of those additions, but it makes it all that more appealing in terms of you know, the immediate attractiveness to the piece and its sort of seductive allure. To the other piece, what you're calling the Matisse reclining woman, which
Reclining figure.
totally makes sense. I mean, that's absolutely, I get that. She's also would be also Bronze Age, and has been historically, these types of figures have been historically considered to be fertility figures. There's a lot of sort of discussion about what that means in contemporary scholarship as well. But it's interesting because, you know, she's missing her head, and it's just the body that we see. And she's very typical of this sort of Anatolian region figurines that were made. And she's also in a case with other figurines that are more schematic, what we call schematic figurines, which are often, for some reason or not, probably because of the shape, called violin figures.
Mhm.
So it's interesting that we make this jump back to music.
Yeah, I thought it was funny that they're called violin because they so predate the violin. It seemed
Yeah.
a little anti-historical, but
It's an analogical description. It has nothing to do with
Yeah.
fact. It's
No.
it's simply plain resemblance. So were they all monochrome, Paul? Do we know if they were originally painted? Like, is there paint left on the skirt of the votive figure, for example?
So for a lot of the votive figurines, they would have been painted. Probably in some cases when they're made out of marble or a stone, they would have received paint or a natural pigment. For the ceramic figurines, those would have received an additional slip or a colored slip. It's interesting because today when you walk into the gallery, you see those really iconic installation of Cycladic figurines, which are so modernist in sort of how they appear, but in actuality, they would have been painted. And they would have had pigmented faces and been done up very well. And so you don't see you don't see that information, that visual information anymore, because of the fact that it's all been eroded away, and some instances cleaned.
So I think it's getting a little bit late. We've covered a lot of territory from 2400 before the Common Era to 2020, 5,000 years suspended time, a lot of beautiful objects and beautiful notes. So thank you so much, Paul, and thank you, Sarah, for this. On behalf of all your fans and listeners here, I'm going to thank you both so much, and thank the Menil and thank DACAMERA for making this whole series and this particular evening possible. And we look forward to the next.
Yeah.
and thank you.
In February, come to the Menil bookstore and rediscover the lost biographies of ancient objects.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Joseph.
Thanks,
Thank
Paul.
you. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Joseph. Thanks, Paul. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Be safe and be well.
Stay safe.